Another substantial difficulty connected with adolescence is the riddle of secondary attachment. Here is the problem. In its present form, the Zurich model explains how the encounter with a potential sex partner is brought about, but not why one later sticks to him or her. Initially, the partner is strange and fascinating, well satisfying the craving for arousal. But later, when a lasting relationship has been established, as it is required to warrant proper care for the offspring, the partners are bound to familiarize. And this would mean, according to the model, that they provide each other more and more security, but less and less arousal. Computer simulation, unbribable as it is, then allows only for two equally fatal outcomes. Either the partners start having affairs with ever-changing paramours, or they acclimatize their autonomy cluster down and decay into a state of psychological castration. As we all know, both happens. But it is scarcely what nature had in mind when she invented monogamous pair bonding. After all, monogamy is working in quite a few animal species, and sometimes even in humans. So the model is liable to explain how this is accomplished. Attachment theory, in its present shape, has not much to offer here. As far as the problem is recognized at all, authors are ready to concede that a sexual partnership may differ some way or other from the situation of a child on mother's lap. However, just like Freudians have to make do with the libido concept, attachment theorists have only a single kind of bonding force on hand to account for both. All they can do is to cover up the theory deficit with a vocabulary whose phrasing sounds halfway professional, whose connotations are accommodating to the common sense, but whose exact location within the theory remains foggy. There is talk of goal-corrected partnership, which sounds somehow cybernetic, without actually having any explanatory value, considering that the relationship between child and caregiver is also goal-corrected. Particularly fancied lately is the formula autonomy in relatedness, which cleverly substitutes attachment with a slightly different label, thereby vaguely adumbrating some structural change without raising doubts that everything is well under control. The Zurich model either has no solution to offer, at least no solution that could already claim to be empirically confirmed. But after all, it makes the problem obvious, rather than glossing it over, and it provides a frame for testable working hypotheses. When constructing such a hypothesis, we had best not resort to sophisticated cognitive mechanisms, since permanent bonding of previously unfamiliar mates is already observable even in birds, the monogamy specialists among vertebrates. Let us reconsider the situation. When the newborn first catches sight of his mother, her appearance is unfamiliar like everything else in the world. The fact that he nevertheless shows no fear response is because substantial parts of the arousal system become functional only later, starting presumably around the age of 8 months. Meanwhile, imprinting-like processes ensure a quick and substantial familiarization with mother and other members of the core family. The prospective marital partner is encountered as a stranger as well, but by this time one has grown up. Now I tend to conjecture that familiarity, if acquired only in adulthood, no longer sinks entirely down to the core, Deep inside, the partner remains a source of arousal, however familiar he or she may come to be on the surface. Assuming that this idea is valid, we can no longer regard familiarity as a one-dimensional quantity. Rather, we have to distinguish two forms of familiarity, a primary and a secondary one. Primary familiarity originates from imprinting. For it to be established, solely continuous proximity in early childhood is required. It can be amplified by intensive affective experiences. But these need not be pleasurable ones, since ducklings, having to walk an electric grid while following the imprinting object, get even stronger attached to it. Secondary familiarity develops more along the lines of traditional learning theory. Its formation is not confined to particular developmental periods, and it is definitely contingent upon the quality of interaction. Here is where the parent's responsiveness to the child's needs becomes crucial and where parental sensitivity has its due placement. To summarize, the idea is that primary familiarity deals with the distinction of acquainted versus alien, secondary familiarity with beneficial versus malign. As long as these two components correspond, everything is just like in the one-dimensional model. But now there is room for two further effects that occur in the case of a discrepancy between the two dimensions of familiarity, provided that there is some asymmetry in their dynamic consequences. If we, for instance, assume that primary familiarity mainly alleviates arousal and only moderately contributes to security, whereas conversely, secondary familiarity has a stronger effect on security than on arousal, we get the following four typical situations. Firstly, in the case of the own mother, both forms of familiarity concur, since she is not only present in a sensitive period, but subsequently caring for her child as well. So in her presence, security is high, arousal nil. Next to a strange person, it is the other way around. The marital partner, however, becoming secondarily familiar, has a chance both to bestow security and to maintain a substantial level of arousal. Most unfavorable is the fourth case. Here, a primary familiar person fails, for whatever reason, to qualify as an appropriate caregiver. This person appears homely in the derogatory sense and nevertheless somehow scary. As I mentioned earlier, this would be a condition for an insecure attachment to develop. All this can only pass for a working hypothesis that remains to be examined empirically. But at least it keeps us aware of an open problem. Now let me conclude with a few remarks concerning the relation of attachment theory to other schools. There are mainly two rivaling approaches, behaviorism and psychoanalysis. I shall not dwell upon behaviorism. Here, it is the ageless controversy over the nature-nurture problem that renders the two approaches incompatible. To assess how attachment theory interrelates with its other rival, psychoanalysis, is more difficult since here the differences are comparatively subtle and complex. Both Freud and Bowlby understood their theories as eventually referring to the neurological substrate of mental processes. And, as I mentioned earlier, both recognized the need to bridge the gap between brain and behavior by way of a systemic terminology. The problem is that the processes thus described have a semantics which, at least in part, is consciously experienced, and its subjective appearance is coded in an entirely different phenomenological language. Behaviorism, conceiving itself as a psychology of the other one, had discarded this language as unscientific. The vocabulary of attachment theory, leaning on ethological tradition, is also essentially looking from outside at its object. It describes the relationship between child and caregiver in terms of what the protagonists do or are unable to do. The concepts chosen depict their interactions, responses, expressions, not the coloring in which they perceive their phenomenal world. Even the inner working models are characterized in terms of how they function, not how they are experienced. With psychoanalysis, it is a different matter. It talks about the ego and the id, about cathexis and unconscious drives, and all this is viewed from the standpoint of the subject, not of the external observer. Nevertheless, psychoanalytic terminology is intended to describe a causal system, but it is confounded with figures that are descriptive of some direct phenomenological experience. What Freud had called the mental apparatus is a hybrid of cybernetics and phenomenology. This renders a comparison with attachment theory rather difficult. Bearing this in mind, let's briefly visit the main landmarks of psychoanalysis. In the development of Freud's doctrine, there are three stages to distinguish. In a first phase, inspired by Schiller's dictum that hunger and love rule the world, he distinguished between what he called object drives and ego drives. The intentionality of the former is focused on reproduction, while the latter is aimed at self-preservation. Then followed a rather short second phase in which the previous object drives, now labeled libido, were promoted to a general mental energy. Furthermore, since one can also love oneself, it seemed feasible to let libido cannibalize the former ego drives as its narcissistic variant. But the idea of an unspecific general energy was somehow blemished because it reeked penetrantly of Carl Gustav Jung, so Freud returned to a dualistic solution in his famous 1920 paper, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. In this final version of his doctrine, Freud condensed all hitherto listed varieties of libido to a singular life instinct. And then he introduced a quite novel construct which he enigmatically named death instinct. For this dualism, there exist two patterns of interpretation, a rather shallow reading and another truly abyssal one. The former is commonly accepted today. It rather simplistically identifies the two drives as love and hate. Let us take a closer look at what is meant by love. Here is a classical quotation, slightly trimmed to make it fit into the slide. The nucleus of what we mean by love naturally consists in sexual love with sexual union as its aim. But we do not separate from this what in any case has a share in the name love. On the one hand, self-love, and on the other, love for parents and children, friendship, and love for humanity in general, and also devotion to concrete objects and to abstract ideas. We are of opinion, then, that language has carried out an entirely justifiable piece of unification in creating the word love with its numerous uses, and that we cannot do better than take it as the basis of our scientific discussions and expositions as well. Without doubt, Freud has confounded sexuality and affectional bonding into a hybrid construct called love, life instinct, or libido. He had not deemed it possible that familial intimacy may in and of itself lead to satiety and psychological castration, so he required a jealous father to ascertain incest avoidance. It is a historical irony that Bowlby, without being aware of it, meaning to divert from Freud, actually retained a covert heritage of psychoanalysis. All he did was replace a predominantly sexually connoted concept with a term associated with security seeking. And he has not, as little as Freud had, recognized the antagonism of the two components. So it seems at first glance that Bowlby only slightly reinterpreted the life instinct by shifting the nucleus of love from sex to attachment and leaving the death instinct out of consideration altogether. But wait, compared with Bowlby's rather simplistic motivational construction, there are some peculiarities in Freud's scheme that require a closer look. In particular, he adhered to this strange claim that while love be directed towards a you, aggression should primarily aim against the own self. However, conceiving of an instinct to destroy oneself runs counter to all biological reasoning. In order to understand this seemingly unnecessary complication, we have to turn to the other, in point of fact earlier, interpretation of Freud's final drive dualism, which he perhaps all too rashly abandoned. It connects the two instincts with a desire to composition or dissolution, respectively. At this juncture, I would like to cast a glance at the Zurich model. It is also designed dualistically, based, on the one hand, on the antagonism of propensities positively correlated with autonomy claim, like enterprise and sex, and on the other hand, a wish for security, the latter being identical with Bowlby's attachment motive. Their opposition reflects the alpha-omega polarity. Among these two poles, the autonomy cluster seems to come closest to the core of Freud's life instinct. But then, what about the death instinct? After all, we had reason to file aggression among the coping strategies. Should we not therefore deny it the status of a fundamental motive? Let's see. Freud assigned another two concepts to his drive dualism, which he called the pleasure and the nirvana principle. Nirvana refers to a craving to return to a state of tension-free rest in which all impatient personal wishes cease and blissful symbiosis with the universe is sensed. Now wait a minute, doesn't this strongly remind us of Monika Meyer-Holzapfel and her drive-intended rest states as goals of appetites? Except that she modestly abstained from giving her drive concept a fancy name, arrogating the discovery of a cosmic principle. Interestingly enough now, ranking foremost in her list of prototypical drive-intended rest states is the unification with what she called Bezugsperson mit Heimvalenz, the reference person with home valence. So we may ask whether the nirvana metaphor does not elicit the vision of an infant at the breast, in the lap, in the uterus of mother. But why on earth could this be called a death instinct? Let us, concerning this question, listen to another one of the early psychoanalytic authorities, Sándor Ferenczi. Here is how he used the concept of death instinct to account for the heightened mortality of children deprived of sensitive caregiving. On account of the dazzling effect of the impressive unfolding of growth at the beginning of life, the view has tended to be that the life and death instincts were a simple complementary series in which the life maximum was placed at the beginning of life and the 0 point at the most advanced age. This does not appear, however, to be quite accurate. And now this is the alternative he proposes. The child has to be induced by means of an immense expenditure of love, tenderness, and care to forgive his parents for having brought him into the world without any intention on his part. Otherwise, the destructive instincts begin to stir immediately. The infant is still much closer to individual non-being than the adult. Slipping back into this non-being might therefore come much more easily to children. The life force which rears itself against the difficulties of life has not therefore any great innate strength. Corresponding to the drop in the curve of mortality in middle age, the life instinct would only counterbalance the destructive tendencies at the age of maturity. What he wants to say is, up to now we have envisioned the life instinct to be strongest in infancy and then gradually decaying during the lifespan, while the opposite is true for the death instinct. But in actual fact, he says, the process ought to be conceived of in this mode, with the life instinct reaching its climax only in early adulthood, and the death instinct again following a complementary regime. It is intriguing to see how Ferenczi addressed exactly the same issue that Bowlby devoted himself to, namely the importance of sensitive and loving care not only for the infant's mental well-being but for his physical survival as well. Both authors only couched the same idea in quite different languages. We can easily recognize the age course of the life and death instincts as postulated by Ferenczi in the ontogeny of the autonomy cluster in the Zurich model, which would amount to the notion, however, that Freud's death instinct is nothing but a travesty of the attachment motive. Could this psychoanalytic parlance in any way be shown to be justified? It can indeed, and the key lies in Freud's notion of assigning the life-death polarity to that of composition and dissolution. Composition means creating structures in a way that allows the components to maintain their profile, whereas dissolution connotes diffusion, decay of form, of contour, of boundary. So it might clarify the issue if we replace the two explanatory terms with two other ones that not only reinterpret the self-destructive intentionality imputed to the so-called death instinct, but first and foremost bridge the semantic gap between the archetypes of mother and death. It must be noted, though, that with terms like contour or boundary, we switch from a systemic to a phenomenological level of description. This may take a little getting used to for attachment scholars, but it proves helpful in our situation as long as we refrain from pigeonizing the two languages. Self-dissolving fusion, also frequently called symbiosis, is indeed a term used by reputable authors such as Margaret Mahler to describe the early relation between infant and mother. Suppose now that autonomy claim, as it increases during ontogeny, is correlated with ego's growing need and strength to fortify itself with a boundary. There is a temptation proceeding from mother to dissolve this boundary and reseed into omega nonage. It is then up to the surfeit response to prevent this. Quite the same danger may arise, though, in the cause of bonding to a new partner. Now, the task of forming a secondary attachment has to be mastered, requiring the art of maintaining that floating balance of otherness and familiarity, autonomy and intimacy, arousal and security, demarcation and unification. There is this ancient Taoist symbol of yin and yang, a bistable figure in terms of perceptual psychology, demonstrating the difficulty of a single boundary shared by two figures, a contour line that neither are supposed to claim for themselves, thus pushing the other one into the background. If the strength does not suffice to maintain this boundary, autonomy claim is acclimatized back and the self dissolves into the partner. Like in this picture drawn by a Swiss schizophrenic patient who had to be hospitalized because of violence, paranoia, and hearing of voices. He drew William Tell and his son in a series of 4 pictures. The first one still appears harmless, aside from an ominous common contour delimiting 2 figures, which is commonly avoided by healthy artists. But then you can see how bonding may turn into decomposition, and we imagine what may have contributed to Freud's conception of the death instinct as being primarily directed against the own self. In the mythology of many cultures, we find a figure like the Hindu goddess Kali, equipped with 2 seemingly contrary attributes. One signaling radiant and outspending maternal love, the other one glowing of cannibalism and vampirism. Age-old wisdom may thus teach us to understand the enigmatic equivalence of attachment and death. But it also highlights the core deficiency of Bowlby's blueprint of the mental apparatus. It suffers from a lateral scotoma in that it denies the intrinsic ambivalence of intimacy. As long as this constructional defect is not repaired, there is little hope for attachment theory to become an effective alternative to psychoanalysis in clinical application. Hopefully, I could demonstrate, though, that this condition may change if Bowlby's rough draft of a theory could be properly refined and clarified. It certainly has the potential to become a frame of reference for therapy, void of the wayward mysticisms of psychoanalysis, grounded on evolutionary psychology, couched in an unequivocal systemic language, and communicable to the intelligent layperson without being trivial. Ladies and gentlemen, I've asked of you to follow me on a long way, starting from a downright mathematical analysis of fish schooling up to a daring excursion into the slippery ground of subtle phenomenology. It would be foolish to expect that all this is already right and final. There remains a lot of work to be done until a systemic analysis of what Freud had named the mental apparatus is ready to become practicable in consulting and therapy. But we should enjoy and even be a little proud of the fact that psychology is a science, perhaps the only science that allows, encourages, even obliges us to encompass all these fascinating and confusingly heterogeneous perspectives of the human condition. Thanks for your attention.